20 years erased from memory, from family, from the world. Samuel Jones existed as a phantom in Charleston's forgotten corners, his past swallowed by an accident that left him with only the present tense. No yesterday, no name that felt true, no face in a photograph to prove he mattered. The social worker's DNA test was meant to be routine, a bureaucratic gesture toward compassion. Instead, it detonated a truth more disorienting than amnesia itself. He was the vanished heir to $500 million, a man the world had mourned while he slept on concrete and begged for survival. Subscribe to witness how a man rebuilds identity from ruins. The morning Samuel Jones woke beneath the overpass on Meeting Street, he performed the same ritual he had executed for 7,000 mornings before. He checked his hands for proof of existence, turned them over in the grey pre-dawn light, traced the lines on his palms as though they might spell out some forgotten alphabet of selfhood. The hands were weathered now, mapped with scars whose origins he could not recall, the knuckles swollen from sleeping on pavement, the fingernails perpetually outlined with the grime of survival. He had no mirror, had avoided mirrors for 2 decades, because the face that looked back never sparked recognition, never whispered, "This is you," never connected to any internal sense of continuity. The man in the glass was a stranger wearing his skin, aged beyond what felt proportional to his interior sense of time, and so he had learned to navigate the world without confronting his own image, moving through Charleston like a ghost who had forgotten he was dead. The city woke around him in layers. First, the delivery trucks rumbling past with their cargo of bread and newspapers, then the joggers with their expensive shoes and wireless earbuds, their bodies moving through space with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they belonged. Samuel folded his blanket with meticulous care, the single possession he treated with reverence, a grey wool thing that a church volunteer had given him 3 winters ago, and he tucked it into the plastic bag that held everything he owned in this world. The bag contained one extra shirt with a stain on the collar he had never successfully removed, a pair of socks with holes worn through the heels, a book he could not read because the words swam on the page like fish refusing to be caught, and a small, smooth stone he had found by the harbour that fit perfectly in his palm. He did not know why he kept the stone, only that holding it sometimes quieted the vast, roaring emptiness where his memories should have been. Hunger announced itself not as pain, but as a hollow, ringing sensation that started in his stomach and radiated outward until his entire body felt insubstantial, weightless, like he might simply dissolve into the humid South Carolina air. He walked toward the shelter on Calhoun Street, where they served breakfast until 9, his gait slow and careful because his left knee had been hurting for weeks now. A deep ache that spoke of damage that would never heal without proper medical attention he could not afford. The sidewalks were familiar beneath his feet, every crack and buckle memorized through repetition, and he navigated them with the unconscious grace of someone who had walked these same routes so many times they had worn grooves into his muscle memory. Other homeless men and women emerged from their sleeping places like nocturnal creatures retreating before daylight, and he nodded to them in recognition. Darrell, who talked to himself in a constant low murmur, Rosa, who pushed a shopping cart filled with aluminum cans and claimed she had once been a dancer, Marcus, whose eyes held a sharpness that suggested he was perhaps the sanest of all of them and had simply opted out of a world that demanded too much. The shelter smelled of industrial disinfectant and coffee, a combination that Samuel had come to associate with temporary safety, with the brief respite of being indoors among people who at least pretended he existed. He stood in line with his plastic tray, accepted the portion of scrambled eggs that gleamed with an oily sheen, the 2 slices of white toast, the cup of coffee that was more water than bean, but carried enough warmth to be worth drinking. He found a seat at the long table near the back where he always sat, in the corner where he could see both exits, a positioning strategy he had developed without understanding why it felt necessary. The eggs tasted of nothing, Or perhaps he had simply forgotten what flavor was supposed to be, his palate dulled by years of eating only what was freely given, nutrition without pleasure, sustenance without joy. Maria appeared at his table as he was finishing his coffee, and he felt the familiar flutter of discomfort that arose whenever she sought him out, because kindness from strangers always felt like a prelude to disappointment. She was younger than him, though everyone seemed younger now, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that held an earnestness he found both touching and exhausting. She worked for some organization whose name he could never quite remember, something about outreach and family reunification, and she had been visiting the shelter for months now, talking to the men and women who lived on the margins, asking questions about their pasts with a gentleness that made him want to both trust and flee her. She sat down across from him without asking permission, which he appreciated because it spared him the awkwardness of having to grant it, and she folded her hands on the table in that way people did when they were preparing to say something they had rehearsed. The conversation that followed would later seem to him like the moment a door he had not known existed suddenly swung open to reveal an entirely different room beyond. She spoke about a DNA testing program designed to help reunite missing persons with their families, explained how a simple swab of the cheek could potentially connect him to relatives who might be searching, might provide answers to the vast blank space where his identity should have been. He listened without much hope, because hope had been trained out of him through 2 decades of discovering that most promises dissolved like sugar in rain. But something in her voice, perhaps the tremor of genuine caring, perhaps simple loneliness on his part, made him agree. She pulled out a kit from her bag, a small plastic tube, and a swab sealed in sterile packaging, and he opened his mouth like a child receiving communion, let her brush the cotton against the inside of his cheek, felt the slight catch of fabric against tissue. She sealed the sample with movements that suggested ritual, wrote his name on the label with careful printing, Samuel Jones, the name he had been given by the shelter staff when he first arrived, with no identification, no memory, nothing but the clothes he wore and the bewildered terror of a man who had woken into existence without context. The weeks that followed the DNA test stretched into a peculiar form of suspension, time moving forward while Samuel remained caught in the amber of not knowing, going through his daily routines with a new layer of consciousness that made everything feel slightly unreal. He continued to sleep beneath the overpass, continued to eat at the shelter, continued to walk the same circuits through downtown Charleston, but now there existed a thin thread connecting him to possibility, and he found himself touching that thread mentally throughout the day, like a tongue returning to a loose tooth. Maria had told him the results would take 4 to 6 weeks, had explained something about laboratories and databases and matching algorithms that meant nothing to him except that somewhere his genetic material was being translated into information, decoded into language that might finally explain who he had been before the accident that had erased him. The accident itself existed in his memory only a sensation without narrative, the feeling of cold water closing over his head, the taste of salt and panic, the sensation of being turned over and over by forces too powerful to resist, and then nothing, a blank wall beyond which no images could penetrate. He had been told by doctors at the free clinic that this pattern suggested traumatic amnesia, that sometimes the brain protected itself from unbearable experiences by severing access to everything that came before, creating a firewall between past and present that could be permanent. They had shown him forms with questions about his age, his hometown, his family, his profession, and he had stared at the blank spaces with a frustration that felt like suffocation, understanding that the answers existed somewhere inside him but had been locked in a room to which he had no key. The doctors had been kind but ultimately helpless. explaining that memory recovery was unpredictable, that he might wake up one morning with everything restored, or he might live the rest of his life in this truncated present tense. And he had left their office feeling more alone than before, because at least ignorance had not forced him to confront the magnitude of his loss. Charleston in autumn carried a particular quality of light that Samuel found both beautiful and melancholy, the sun taking on a golden cast that made even the most ordinary scenes. A bicycle leaning against a lamppost, laundry hanging from a balcony, a child's chalk drawing on the sidewalk seemed weighted with significance. He spent his afternoons in the park near the Battery, sitting on a bench that overlooked the harbour, watching the boats move across the water with their sails bright against the blue, and he wondered if he had once known how to sail, if his hands had once held ropes and understood their language. The wondering itself was a form of torture because it emphasized absence, made him conscious of all the skills and knowledge and experiences that should have been his but were not, left him feeling like a book with most of its pages torn out, the remaining fragments insufficient to construct meaning. Other homeless people came and went from the park, some nodding to him in acknowledgement of shared circumstance, others lost so deep in their own internal worlds that they moved through space without registering the presence of fellow travelers. Samuel had learned not to ask too many questions about other people's stories because the answers were usually too sad to carry, but occasionally someone would sit beside him and talk anyway, words spilling out as though the simple act of speaking to another human being was valuable regardless of whether connection occurred. A woman named Dorothy, her face creased with age and sun damage, told him about her son who had stopped calling 5 years ago, about how she had lost her apartment when the rent increased and her social security check could not stretch far enough, about how she sometimes forgot what year it was and wandered the streets looking for the house she had grown up in, which had been demolished decades ago to make room for a parking garage. Samuel listened with the patience of someone who understood that being heard was sometimes the only gift one person could give another, and when Dorothy finished talking, she patted his hand and called him a good listener, which made him feel useful for the first time in weeks. The dreams that visited him during this waiting period carried a new intensity, fragmentary images that felt more like memories trying to surface than random neurological noise. He dreamed of a large house with white columns, of sunlight falling through tall windows onto polished wood floors, of voices calling a name that was not Samuel, but that rang with familiarity anyway. He dreamed of a woman with dark hair and green eyes who smiled at him with such tenderness that he woke with tears on his face, though whether she was his mother or wife or sister or some composite of longing he could not say. He dreamed of water, always water, of being pulled under by currents that had their own intention, of the terror of lungs burning for air, and he would wake gasping and disoriented, his heart hammering against his ribs as though trying to escape his chest. The dreams left him exhausted, made him dread sleep even as his body demanded it, and he began to drink more coffee than was probably wise, using caffeine to keep himself in wakefulness where at least the emptiness was predictable. Maria came to find him in the park on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks and 3 days after he had taken the test, and he knew before she spoke that something had changed because her face carried an expression he could not quite pass. Excitement mixed with something that looked almost like fear. She sat beside him on the bench and for a long moment said nothing, just looked out at the harbour as though gathering courage, and he felt his stomach tighten with anticipation or dread, those two emotions so similar in their physical manifestation that he could not distinguish between them. When she finally turned to face him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and she reached for his hand in a gesture that felt both professional and deeply personal, and she said the words that would fracture his entire understanding of reality. The DNA test had found a match, but not the kind they had expected, not distant relatives or a lost family searching for him, but something so improbable that it required lawyers and verification and a complete upheaval of everything he thought he knew about his own insignificance in the world. The lawyers arrived at the shelter 3 days later in suits that cost more than Samuel had seen in cash in 2 decades, their shoes polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent lights overhead like mirrors, their briefcases made of leather that smelled of wealth and consequence. They asked to speak with him in private, and the shelter director led them all to a small office that was usually used for counseling sessions, a room with motivational posters on the walls, and a box of tissues permanently stationed on the desk as though tears were an expected outcome of any conversation held there. Samuel sat in the chair they indicated, his body tense with the animal awareness that something enormous was approaching, and he watched as the lead lawyer, a man named Richard with silver hair and a manner that suggested decades of delivering information that changed lives, opened a folder and spread documents across the desk as though laying out evidence at a trial. The story they told him required multiple retellings before it began to penetrate the defensive numbness with which he processed information that contradicted his fundamental understanding of himself. They explained that his DNA had matched not just any family line, but one of the most prominent lineages in American history, that he was not Samuel Jones at all, but rather Edmund Vanderbilt, the youngest son of the Vanderbilt dynasty, a man who had been declared lost at sea 50 years ago when his sailing yacht had capsized during a storm off the South Carolina coast. They showed him photographs of a young man in his 20s, handsome and confident, standing on the deck of a sailboat with the wind in his hair and the future bright in his eyes, and they said, "This is you. This was you." And he stared at the images with a disconnection so profound it felt like vertigo, like the floor of the room had become unstable beneath him. The lawyers explained about the estate that had been held in trust, about the $500 million that had accrued interest and investment returns over 5 decades, about the legal presumption of demise that had frozen the inheritance in a kind of legal suspended animation, waiting for either definitive proof of passing or the impossibility of his return to trigger its distribution to more distant relatives. They explained that the DNA match had been flagged immediately by multiple systems because the Vanderbilt family had submitted samples decades ago as part of efforts to identify remains, that the probability of error was essentially zero, that genetic science had advanced to the point where identity could be established with absolute certainty. They spoke with the careful precision of people accustomed to dealing with situations that exceeded normal emotional parameters, but their eyes kept darting to his face as though looking for signs of the person he used to be, searching for Edmund Vanderbilt beneath the weathered exterior of Samuel Jones. He found himself unable to speak, his throat closed, with an emotion too large and complex to name. Something that combined grief and disbelief and a strange, hollow rage at the universe for its capacity to misplace a human life so completely. The photographs the lawyers showed him might as well have been images of a stranger, no spark of recognition firing in his neural pathways, no sense of, yes, that is me, that was my face, those were my hands. They told him about his family, a mother and father long since passed, who had spent years searching for him before their own demise finally released them from the agony of not knowing. Siblings who had scattered to different lives, carrying the wound of his disappearance like shrapnel they could never quite extract. They told him about the yacht that had been found capsized but empty, about the Coast Guard search that had continued for weeks, about the memorial service held in an estate chapel where they had mourned him without a body, without closure, without the final punctuation mark that a casket provides. Maria sat beside him throughout the explanation, her hand on his arm, as though physically tethering him to the present moment, and he found himself focusing on that touch because everything else felt too immense to process. The information coming at him like a wave too large to ride, threatening to tumble him into chaos. The lawyers presented documents that required his signature, papers establishing his identity through genetic evidence, forms beginning the process of claiming the estate, and he signed where they indicated with handwriting that looked nothing like the signature samples they showed him from 50 years ago. His hand had learned a different way of forming letters, muscle memory rebuilt from scratch, and even his name on paper testified to the truth that he was not the same person he had been before the water erased him. They spoke about next steps, about moving him into secure housing, about medical evaluations and psychological support, and legal procedures that would take months to complete, and he heard the words but could not quite attach them to his own future, could not imagine a version of himself who lived anywhere but in the margins he had occupied for so long. When the lawyers finally left, promising to return the next day to begin the transition process, Samuel sat in the small office with Maria and felt something crack open inside him, not relief or joy, but a grief so profound it seemed to hollow him out from within. He had been no one for 20 years, had made a kind of peace with his own insignificance, had learned to find small moments of grace in sunlight and coffee, and the kindness of strangers who asked for nothing in return. The revelation that he had been someone important, someone mourned, someone whose absence had left a hole in the world, did not feel like restoration, but like violence, like being told that every moment of the last 2 decades had been based on a fundamental error, that the person he had become, through suffering and adaptation, was somehow less real than the ghost of Edmund Vanderbilt, who haunted those old photographs. He put his head in his hands and wept for reasons he could not articulate, and Maria held him while he shook with the impossible task of reconciling 2 lives that had no bridge between them, no narrative thread that could connect the privileged young man on the sailboat to the old homeless man who had learned to make himself invisible in order to survive. They moved him to a hotel on the waterfront 3 days later, a place with soft beds and room service, and windows that overlooked the harbor where the accident that had unmade him had occurred 50 years ago. Samuel, though they were all trying to call him Edmund now, and he could not quite respond to that name without a moment of confusion, stood at those windows for hours, watching the water change color with the shifting light, trying to find in himself some cellular memory of having loved sailing, of having chosen to go out in a storm, of having been the kind of person who owned a yacht and understood navigation and belonged to a world where $500 million was a meaningful sum. The hotel room felt like a stage set, too clean and coordinated, the furniture arranged with deliberate aesthetic intention, and he found himself missing the authenticity of sleeping rough, the way the street made no pretense about what it was, demanded no performance of normalcy or comfort. Maria visited every day, bringing paperwork and updates and a steadiness that anchored him when everything else felt like it was dissolving. She explained that the lawyers were working to establish his legal identity, that there would need to be hearings and depositions, that the distant relatives who had been expecting to inherit would likely contest the claim despite the genetic evidence, because $500 million was enough money to make people willing to fight biology itself. She told him about the social worker assigned to his case who specialized in trauma and memory, about the doctors who wanted to run tests to understand the extent of his amnesia and whether there was any possibility of recovery, about the financial advisors who were preparing to explain his holdings and investments, and the complex architecture of wealth that had been growing in his absence like a garden no one had planted, but that had flourished anyway. He tried to eat the meals the hotel delivered, but found that his stomach had forgotten how to process rich food, the sauces and seasonings overwhelming his palate that had adapted to bland survival rations, and he ended up ordering plain toast and eggs, simple things that his body could recognize as nourishment. Sleep came irregularly, his mind too agitated to rest, cycling through the information he had been given like a computer trying to process data that exceeded its programming. He dreamed of the photographs the lawyers had shown him, dreamed that he was watching Edmund Vanderbilt from a distance, observing that young man's life like a film, unable to step into the frame and claim any ownership of those experiences. The dreams left him feeling more fractured than before, emphasized the chasm between who he had been and who he had become, made him wonder if identity was really continuous at all, or just a story we told ourselves to create the illusion of coherence across time. On the fourth day in the hotel, Richard the lawyer brought someone new to meet him, a woman in her 60s with elegant silver hair and Edmund's eyes, or what Edmund's eyes must have looked like before age and exposure weathered them into something harder. She introduced herself as Catherine, his sister, the only sibling still living, and she studied his face with an intensity that made him want to look away, her gaze hungry for recognition that he could not provide. She told him about their childhood in Charleston, about summers at the family estate in Newport, about the sailing lessons their father had insisted on, about the way Edmund had always been the adventurous one, the risk-taker, the son who pushed boundaries while his siblings played it safe. She showed him more photographs from phones and tablets, decades of family history he had missed, weddings and births and funerals and holidays. And with each image, the weight of his absence grew heavier, the magnitude of what he had lost and what had been lost by losing him becoming more tangible and more devastating. Catherine wept when she spoke about their mother, about how the not knowing had consumed her final years, how she had never stopped believing that Edmund might still be alive somewhere, suffering from amnesia or captivity or some fate that prevented him from returning home. She described the private investigators hired year after year, the psychics consulted in desperation, the way their mother had kept Edmund's room exactly as he had left it, a shrine to suspended time, refusing to pack away his belongings because that would have meant accepting his permanent absence. When their mother finally passed, Catherine said it had felt almost like a relief, because at least the torture of uncertainty had ended for her. Though the family had carried the wound forward, Edmund's disappearance a hole in their collective story that could never be properly healed, because there was no body to mourn, no clear ending to grieve. Now here he was, Catherine said, alive but also not alive, returned but not returned, and she did not know whether to celebrate or weep, and so she did both, her face wet with tears that Samuel understood intellectually, but could not quite feel as his own. He wanted to be able to give her something, some fragment of recognition, some emotional response that would make this reunion feel complete, but all he could offer was honesty about his emptiness, his lack of memory, the way Edmund Vanderbilt felt no more real to him than a character in a book. Catherine listened with a kind of devastated acceptance, and when she finally left, she hugged him, with a fierceness that spoke of 20 years of grief compressed into a single embrace, and she whispered that she was grateful he was alive, even if he could not remember being her brother, that his survival mattered regardless of whether his memory ever returned. After she left, Samuel sat on the hotel bed and felt the weight of all those years of searching and mourning and hoping settle onto his shoulders, felt the responsibility of being alive when everyone had given up. And he wondered if it was possible to be simultaneously grateful for survival and resentful of the burden of returning, of having to carry other people's expectations and grief when he could barely carry his own confusion. The lawyers laid out the structure of his wealth across the conference table, like archaeologists arranging artifacts from an excavation, each document representing a different aspect of an empire he had inherited, without ever understanding its language or logic. Richard walked him through the portfolio with patience that suggested he was accustomed to explaining complex financial structures to people who had no framework for understanding them. Real estate holdings scattered across 3 continents, stock portfolios diversified through generations of careful management, trusts and foundations, and offshore accounts whose purposes remained obscure to Samuel even after multiple explanations. The numbers themselves became meaningless after a certain point, too large to connect to any concrete reality. $500 million, an abstraction that his mind could not translate into tangible value, into things he could touch or use or distribute. He asked about his obligations, about what inheriting this fortune required of him beyond simply existing. And the lawyers explained about taxes and legal responsibilities, about board positions in family companies that would expect his participation at least nominally, about charitable foundations that carried the Vanderbilt name and required oversight. They spoke about investment advisors and accountants and estate managers who had been maintaining the machinery of wealth in his absence and who would now report to him, people whose livelihoods depended on decisions he had no experience making, whose expertise far exceeded his own, but who would nonetheless look to him for approval and direction. The prospect of managing any of this felt overwhelming to the point of impossibility, like being handed the controls of an aircraft without ever having learned to fly, and he felt a spike of panic at the thought of being responsible for systems he could not comprehend, let alone control. Maria had accompanied him to the meeting at his request, her presence a kind of lifeline to the world he understood, and she watched the proceedings with an expression he could not quite read, something between happiness for his good fortune and a sadness that seemed to acknowledge that this wealth would inevitably change him, would pull him away from the community of people who had known him as Samuel Jones, and into a realm where Edmund Vanderbilt was expected to perform a version of personhood that had nothing to do with who he had actually become. When there was a break in the presentation, she asked the lawyers about whether the money could be used immediately for charitable purposes, whether he could direct funds toward homeless services and affordable housing and the kinds of supports that might have prevented his own 2 decades of suffering. The lawyers exchanged glances that suggested this was an unusual question for an heir to ask, but they confirmed that yes, once the estate was legally transferred, he would have full authority to allocate resources however he wished within certain tax and legal constraints. The idea that he could use this accidental fortune to prevent other people from experiencing what he had endured was the first thought that made the inheritance feel like something other than a burden or a cosmic joke. Samuel asked for information about homeless populations in Charleston, about shelter capacity and waiting lists, about the gap between existing services and actual need. And as the lawyers provided statistics and reports, he felt something shift inside him, a sense of purpose crystallizing out of the chaos of his displacement. He did not know how to be Edmund Vanderbilt, did not know how to navigate country clubs or boardrooms or whatever spaces wealthy people occupied, but he knew intimately what it meant to sleep on concrete and beg for food and watch people look through you as though you were transparent. And if this money could buy visibility and shelter and dignity for people who had been erased by circumstance, then perhaps his own erasure and return held some meaning after all. The lawyers responded to his questions with increasing warmth, seemed to relax into the conversation as they realized he was not going to demand yachts or mansions or the trappings of wealth, but instead wanted to understand how to deploy resources toward addressing human suffering. Richard mentioned a legal structure called a charitable foundation that would allow him to direct funds systematically while gaining tax advantages, explained how such foundations could be staffed with experts who understood non-profit work and social services, how he could set policy direction without having to manage every detail. The conversation became technical again, full of terms like endowments and grant-making and program evaluation. But Samuel felt less lost in this discussion because at least it connected to something tangible, to outcomes he could imagine, even if the mechanisms remained partially opaque. By the time the meeting concluded, hours later, they had sketched out a preliminary plan, a significant portion of the estate would be used to establish the Vanderbilt Foundation for Housing Justice, with a mission focused on ending homelessness through a combination of emergency shelter, transitional housing, and permanent supportive housing for those with mental health or substance use issues. The lawyers would work with non-profit consultants to develop the structure, would identify board members with relevant expertise, would create systems to ensure accountability and effectiveness. Samuel signed preliminary documents authorizing the lawyers to begin this work, his signature still awkward and unfamiliar on the expensive paper. And when he finished, Richard looked at him with an expression that held genuine respect, told him that most people who came into sudden wealth focused on consumption rather than contribution, that his instinct toward service was unusual and admirable. Samuel did not feel admirable, felt instead like someone desperately trying to find a foothold in a landscape that kept shifting beneath him, but he accepted the compliment with a nod and allowed himself to feel, for the first time since the revelation of his identity, that perhaps this impossible situation might contain the possibility of redemption. The therapist they assigned to him, a woman named Dr. Claire Patterson, who specialized in trauma and dissociative disorders, met with him 3 times a week in an office that felt deliberately neutral, walls painted in soft colors that suggested calm without demanding it, furniture comfortable without being ostentatious, a box of tissues within reach but not obviously displayed. She asked him to call her Claire, explained that their work together would focus not on recovering his memories, which might never return, but on helping him integrate the 2 identities that now existed in uncomfortable parallel. Edmund, the wealthy heir, and Samuel, the homeless survivor, 2 people who shared a body but seemingly little else. She told him that identity was more fluid than most people believed, that we were all constantly creating ourselves through the stories we told about our lives, and that his situation was unusual only in degree, not in kind, that everyone who survived trauma had to negotiate the discontinuity between before and after. The sessions began with simple questions about his daily experience, about what it felt like to move through the world in his current body, and Samuel found himself describing the strangeness of clean clothes and regular meals, how his stomach still expected hunger, how he woke in the hotel bed disoriented by softness, reaching for the blanket he no longer needed and the plastic bag that no longer contained all his possessions. He talked about the guilt of having money while his friends from the street continued to struggle, about seeing Daryl and Rosa and Marcus at the shelter, and feeling like a traitor for having escaped through sheer genetic accident, about wanting to help them all, but not knowing how to do so without creating a dynamic that felt patronizing or that would change the fundamental honesty of relationships that had been forged in shared vulnerability. Claire listened with the kind of attention that made him feel like his words mattered, taking notes occasionally, but mostly maintaining eye contact, letting silence sit when it needed to sit, rather than rushing to fill every gap with interpretation or advice. She asked him what he thought he had lost when he lost his memory, and he struggled to articulate it, not just facts and names and skills, but something more fundamental, the internal narrative that connects experience into continuity, the sense of being a person with a history rather than a consciousness that simply appeared fully formed one day without context. She suggested that perhaps what he had actually lost was a particular story about who Edmund Vanderbilt was supposed to be, and that in losing that story, he had gained the freedom to discover who he actually was beneath the layers of expectation and privilege and family legacy. The idea felt both liberating and terrifying, suggested that his amnesia might be not just a tragedy, but also a kind of gift, an opportunity to rebuild identity according to his own values rather than inherited ones. They talked about the photographs of young Edmund, about the disconnect between that image and his internal sense of self, and Claire proposed an exercise, that he look at those photographs not as pictures of himself, but as images of a stranger whose life he had inherited along with the fortune, that he approach Edmund's history the way a biographer might study a subject, with curiosity rather than the pressure of identification. The reframing helped, allowed him to examine the evidence of Edmund's life without the vertigo of trying to claim it as his own memory, to acknowledge that yes, this person existed and yes, genetically they were the same, but that continuity of consciousness, of lived experience, of earned identity had been severed in the cold water 50 years ago and could not simply be stitched back together through legal documents and DNA evidence. Dr. Patterson introduced him to concepts from literature on trauma and memory, about how the self was not a fixed entity, but a process, about how neuroplasticity meant that brains rebuilt themselves constantly throughout life, about how the Samuel Jones who had survived 20 years on the streets was no less real or valid than the Edmund Vanderbilt who had sailed yachts and attended debutante balls. She suggested that perhaps he did not need to choose between these identities, but could instead acknowledge both as true, could carry forward the wisdom and resilience that Samuel had learned, while also accepting the resources and opportunities that Edmund's genetics had provided. The synthesis she proposed sounded elegant in theory, but remained difficult to embody in practice, because every time someone called him Edmund, he felt a flicker of fraud, and every time he signed his old name, he was reminded that signatures could lie, could assert identity that existed only on paper and in databases, but nowhere in the felt sense of being alive in a particular body with a particular history. Toward the end of one session, Claire asked him what he wanted, setting aside all the expectations and obligations and other people's needs, and he found himself without an immediate answer, realized that he had spent 20 years learning to want as little as possible, training himself not to desire because desire in the context of homelessness was just another vector for suffering. But as he sat with the question, let it percolate through the layers of his consciousness, he recognized that what he wanted most was not wealth or comfort or even the restoration of his memories, but simply to be useful, to live in a way that reduced suffering rather than adding to it, to make meaning out of the accident of his survival by ensuring that other people did not have to endure what he had endured. The clarity of this desire surprised him, felt like solid ground beneath his feet for the first time since the lawyers had arrived at the shelter, and Claire smiled when he articulated it, told him that knowing what he wanted was the first step toward building a life that felt authentic rather than imposed, that he was further along in his integration than he realized. The building they showed him had been a hotel once, a mid-century structure downtown that had fallen into disrepair and stood vacant for years, windows boarded up and graffiti marking its walls like scars testifying to decades of municipal neglect. The real estate agent walked him through the gutted interior with careful steps around debris and broken tile, explaining that the property could be purchased and renovated into transitional housing, that the bones of the structure were solid, even if everything cosmetic needed replacement, that the location was ideal because it sat within walking distance of job centers and public transportation and the social services people would need to rebuild their lives. Samuel moved through the empty rooms with Maria beside him, and he tried to imagine these spaces filled not with tourists and business travelers, but with people like him, people who had been invisible, people who needed more than a bed for one night, but a genuine foundation from which to reconstruct stability. The architect they hired was a woman named Jennifer, who had experience designing supportive housing, who understood that architecture could either reinforce dignity or strip it away, that details like private bathrooms and lockable doors and windows that actually opened mattered immensely to people whose autonomy had been systematically denied by the conditions of homelessness. She showed them plans that included not just sleeping rooms, but communal kitchens, where residents could prepare their own meals, common areas designed for both socializing and solitude, offices for case managers and counselors who would provide wraparound services, a laundry facility, so people would not have to choose between clean clothes and other necessities. Jennifer spoke about trauma-informed design, about how certain features, like clear sightlines and multiple exits, helped people who had lived in constant threat feel safer, about how incorporating natural light and access to outdoor space contributed to psychological well-being in measurable ways. Samuel walked the perimeter of the building with the architect and the contractor, listening to discussions about load-bearing walls and plumbing infrastructure and electrical capacity, and he felt simultaneously overwhelmed by the complexity and energized by the tangibility of it all. This was not abstract wealth sitting in accounts he could not touch, but money being converted into concrete and drywall and windows, into physical space that would house actual human bodies, into an intervention that would interrupt the grinding machinery of poverty that had consumed 2 decades of his own existence. He asked questions about timeline and budget, about how many people the building could serve and what kinds of support services would be most effective, and the architect and contractor answered with patience that suggested they respected his investment, not just financially, but emotionally. Maria coordinated with local homeless service providers to understand existing gaps and needs, and she brought back reports that confirmed what Samuel already knew from lived experience, that emergency shelters were consistently full, that people waited months or years for subsidized housing, that many who could benefit from services never accessed them because the bureaucracy was too difficult to navigate, or because mental health issues or substance use or criminal records or simple exhaustion made them unable to jump through the required hoops. The foundation they were establishing would need to address not just housing, but the constellation of barriers that kept people trapped in homelessness, would need to provide not just a roof, but case management and healthcare and job training, and the patience to work with individuals whose trust in institutions had been destroyed by repeated failures. They held a planning meeting at the law offices with representatives from various non-profit organizations, and Samuel sat at the head of the conference table, feeling profoundly out of place among these professionals, with their degrees and expertise and fluency in the language of social services. But when they asked him to speak about his vision for the foundation, he found words not from Edmund Vanderbilt's education, but from Samuel Jones's hard-won understanding of what it meant to be discarded by society. He talked about the importance of treating residents as full human beings rather than as problems to be solved, about how autonomy and choice were as essential as shelter, about how many homeless people had been failed repeatedly by systems that demanded compliance without offering genuine support. He described the shelter workers who had treated him with kindness versus those who had wielded what little power they had punitively. How much difference small gestures of respect had made when everything else in his life reinforced his worthlessness. The non-profit directors listened with expressions that shifted from professional courtesy to genuine engagement, and several of them spoke afterward about how rare it was to hear someone with resources talk about housing justice from the perspective of lived experience rather than abstract charity. A woman who ran a mental health clinic for homeless populations told him that trauma-informed care was often discussed but rarely funded adequately, that his willingness to invest in comprehensive services rather than just beds could transform outcomes in ways that basic shelter alone never could. A man who directed a job training program emphasized the importance of addressing the whole person, of recognizing that employment was important but that people needed stability and health and healing before they could successfully sustain work, that rushing people into jobs without proper support often led to failure that reinforced their sense of hopelessness. By the end of the meeting, they had sketched out a collaborative model where the foundation would provide housing and coordinate with existing service providers rather than trying to duplicate their expertise, where residents would have access to mental health care and substance abuse treatment and job training and whatever else they needed, but would not be required to participate in anything as a condition of housing. Where the fundamental premise was that stable housing was a prerequisite for addressing other challenges rather than something that had to be earned through compliance. Samuel signed documents authorizing the initial funding for renovations and program development, and as he watched his signature dry on the paper, he felt something that might have been hope, fragile and tentative but present nonetheless. The sense that perhaps his accidental survival and equally accidental wealth could be transformed into something that honored both Samuel's suffering and Edmund's resources. That perhaps he did not have to choose between his two identities, but could allow them to work in concert toward a purpose that made sense of the senseless trajectory his life had taken. The building renovation took 8 months, and Samuel visited the construction site every week, watching the transformation from abandoned ruin to functional shelter, the way skilled hands converted decay into possibility. He learned the names of the workers, brought coffee for the crews, asked questions about their trades, and several of them told him they appreciated working on a project that clearly mattered. That building housing for homeless people felt different from constructing luxury condominiums or office buildings, felt like their labor was contributing to something larger than profit. The foreman, a man named Carlos, who had been in construction for 30 years, told Samuel that he had once been homeless himself after a divorce and job loss, had spent 6 months living in his truck before finally getting back on his feet. And he worked on this building with particular care because he understood in his bones what it would mean to the people who would eventually live there. Maria coordinated the hiring of staff, case managers and counselors and support workers who brought both professional training and often their own experiences with housing insecurity or addiction or mental health challenges. People who understood that the distance between stability and crisis was often much smaller than those who had never approached that edge believed. They conducted training sessions on trauma-informed care, on harm reduction approaches that met people where they were rather than demanding they meet arbitrary standards before receiving help, on the importance of maintaining boundaries while also extending genuine compassion. Samuel attended some of these trainings and found himself both learning and contributing. His knowledge of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of services, informing discussions about policy and practice in ways that research alone could not capture. The first residents moved in on a crisp October morning, 15 people selected from the shelter and street outreach program, individuals who had been living rough for years and who approached the building with a mixture of hope and suspicion, their bodies carrying the vigilance that homelessness required, their eyes scanning for catches and conditions even as they accepted keys to their own rooms. Samuel stood in the lobby as they entered, and he recognized several faces from his own time at the shelter. Rosa with her shopping cart, which staff helped her store safely in a basement area designated for residents' belongings. Marcus, whose sharp intelligence now had space to emerge without the constant cognitive load of survival. A younger woman named Keisha, who had aged out of foster care and been homeless since 18, and who wept when she saw the room that would be hers. The private bathroom, the window that looked out onto a courtyard with young trees planted in hopeful rows. He had insisted that the foundation be called not the Vanderbilt Foundation, which the lawyers had initially proposed, but the Second Chance Housing Collaborative, a name that acknowledged both the residents who would live there and his own improbable return from erasure. The dedication ceremony was small and deliberately low-key, attended by city officials and non-profit partners and some of the workers who had built the renovation. And when they asked Samuel to say a few words, he spoke not about philanthropy or civic duty, but about the 20 years he had spent invisible, about the people who had shown him kindness when they had no obligation to do so, about his hope that this building would be a place where people could rest and heal and remember that their lives had value regardless of their current circumstances. His voice broke several times during the short speech, and Maria stood beside him with her hand on his shoulder, steadying him through the emotion that threatened to overflow his capacity to contain it. Catherine attended the dedication, and afterward she walked through the building with him, visiting the communal kitchen and the library of donated books, and the art room where residents could paint or draw or engage in whatever creative expression helped them process their experiences. She told him that their mother would have been proud, that the Vanderbilt legacy had included philanthropy, but often of the more distant sort, checks written to institutions rather than direct engagement with the people being served, and that what he was doing felt more immediate and more necessary. She asked if he had started to feel like Edmund yet, if the months of being back in the world of wealth and influence had awakened any dormant memories or sense of connection to his previous identity. And he told her honestly that Edmund still felt like someone else, that he was learning to respond to the name, but that internally he remained Samuel, that perhaps he would always be both and neither, existing in the space between identities without ever fully inhabiting either. They walked together to the harbor as the sun lowered toward the horizon, painting the water in shades of amber and rose. And they stood looking out at the place where 50 years ago a young man had sailed into a storm and never returned, where the person Edmund had been had ended, and the person Samuel would become had been violently initiated into being. Catherine asked what he thought had really happened that day, what sequence of events had led from the capsized yacht to waking on a beach with no memory, no identification, no ability to find his way back to the life he had left. Samuel told her what the doctors had theorized, that he had been thrown from the boat and hit his head, that the combination of traumatic brain injury and near drowning had severed his access to previous memory, that he had likely wandered confused and injured until someone had taken him to a hospital where, without identification and unable to provide his own name, he had been processed through systems designed for indigent patients and eventually released onto streets he had once known as a wealthy resident, but now navigated as a ghost. The randomness of it haunted him more than the tragedy, that inches or seconds different, and he might have drowned cleanly, or might have been rescued with his memory intact, or might have hit his head at a slightly different angle and remembered everything. That his entire life had pivoted on chance, on the chaos of physics and weather and the limits of neurological resilience, felt both meaningless and unbearably significant. Suggested that identity itself was far more fragile than people wanted to believe, that the continuous self we imagined we inhabited was actually contingent on factors beyond our control, that any of us could wake tomorrow as strangers to ourselves given the right combination of misfortune. Catherine reached for his hand as they stood watching the water, and he let her hold it, accepted this small gesture of connection, even though she was holding the hand of a brother whose interiority she could never fully access, whose memories of their shared childhood existed for her, but not for him. In the months that followed, the Second Chance Housing Collaborative expanded. They purchased and renovated 2 more buildings, developed partnerships with healthcare providers and employers, created pathways from emergency shelter to transitional housing to permanent supportive housing, helped dozens and then hundreds of people move from the streets into stability. Samuel visited the sites regularly, talking with residents, listening to their stories, making sure the buildings remained places of dignity rather than warehouses for poverty. Several people told him that having leadership who actually understood what it meant to be homeless made a difference, that they trusted the program more because they could see in his eyes that he knew what he was talking about when he spoke about the trauma of invisibility and the long road back to believing you deserved better, Dr. Patterson continued to work with him on integrating his dual identity, and gradually he came to a kind of peace with the paradox of being both Samuel and Edmund, of carrying memories of street survival alongside genetic connection to privilege, of inhabiting a body that was 70 years old, but whose continuous conscious experience spanned only the last 50 years. He would never remember being young Edmund Vanderbilt, would never recover the first 20 years of that life, but he had 50 years of Samuel Jones that were fully his. And the merging of these two tributaries into a single current was perhaps the best resolution available given the impossible circumstances. He learned to introduce himself as Samuel Edmund Jones Vanderbilt, a name that acknowledged all the parts of who he was, and when people asked about the unusual construction, he told them the truth. That identity was complicated, that we contained multitudes, that his name reflected a life that had been broken and reassembled into something that did not match the original, but had its own integrity nonetheless. On the first anniversary of the DNA test results, Maria organized a small celebration at the original shelter where they had met, and Samuel stood in the dining hall where he had eaten so many meals and felt the full weight of the year's transformation. From homeless man with no past to philanthropist with resources beyond measure, from invisible to recognized, from alone to connected to a web of people whose lives had touched his and been touched by his in return. The shelter residents sang happy birthday to him, even though it was not his birthday, just the anniversary of his rebirth into identified existence, and he accepted their off-key singing with gratitude that made his throat tight. Maria presented him with a gift wrapped in newspaper, and when he opened it, he found the smooth stone he had carried for years in his plastic bag, the one that fit perfectly in his palm, which she had somehow retrieved and mounted on a small wooden base with a plaque that read, "You were always someone. The world just forgot to look." He carried that stone with him always after that, kept it in his pocket as a reminder that the years as Samuel Jones had not been wasted time or lost life, but rather a different kind of education, one that taught him things Edmund Vanderbilt could never have learned within the insulation of wealth and privilege. The homeless man and the heir existed together now in an uneasy synthesis, and he had stopped trying to resolve the tension between them, had learned instead to let both voices speak, to draw on Samuel's hard-won wisdom about human vulnerability while deploying Edmund's resources toward addressing it. The $500 million was being spent down systematically, converted from abstract wealth into housing and healthcare and hope, and he told the lawyers to plan for the foundation to eventually spend itself out of existence rather than perpetuating in perpetuity, because the goal was not to build an institution that would carry his name forward, but to solve the problem of homelessness as completely as money and will could solve it. In quiet moments, usually late at night, when sleep eluded him and he stood at the hotel window looking out at the harbor, Samuel thought about the young man who had sailed into that storm 50 years ago, wondered what Edmund had been thinking in those final moments before the water took him, whether he had been afraid or exhilarated or simply focused on survival, whether some part of him had known that he was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return to the person he had been. He felt tenderness toward that young man, protective almost, though they were technically the same person, separated only by traumatic rupture and 5 decades of divergent experience. He hoped Edmund had not suffered too much in the drowning and rebirth, hoped the amnesia had been mercy rather than curse, and he tried to live in a way that would honor both lives, the one that had ended in cold water and the one that had begun on an anonymous beach with nothing but the terrifying freedom of a blank slate. The buildings filled with people finding their way back to stability, and Samuel learned all their names, learned their stories, sat with them in the common areas, and listened as they processed the disorientation of moving from street to shelter. The strange grief that sometimes came with finally being safe, because safety meant you could no longer use survival mode to avoid feeling everything you had suppressed. He understood that grief in his bones, recognized in their faces the same vertigo he felt daily, the sense of life having taken a turn so sharp that the person you were before the turn seemed like someone from a dream or story rather than continuous with who you were after. They were all rebuilding selves from available materials, all learning to inhabit bodies that carried histories they could not change, all trying to construct meaning from the randomness of circumstance that had brought them to this particular intersection of suffering and grace. And in their collective effort to move forward, while carrying the weight of backward, Samuel found something that resembled family, a chosen kinship forged not through blood or memory, but through shared understanding of what it meant to survive your own erasure and to insist on mattering anyway, to take up space and breathe and claim your portion of dignity and shelter and the absolute minimum of what every human being deserved, simply by virtue of being alive and present, and here, still here, despite everything that had tried to disappear them from the world.